told me, you've got a hearing problem. Went through a bunch of tests and, she said, you're a candidate. So I was glad to hear that, and it wasn't all in my head. It actually is in my head. So hopefully by next week I'll be able to hear you all better. I don't know how many of you grew up believing that your mom was the perfect picture of your Proverbs 31 woman. A lot of people believe that they have a perfect mom, perfect dad, and that they think they do no wrong. I can remember growing up, and when we got older, my mom would start sharing some stories, and I didn't know that story. Oh, Mom, you're not exactly what I thought you were. I found out that when she was young, she was what I would call a player. My dad, who was her pen pal in the war, would come to see her when he was on furlough, and when he got out of the war, he went down, and my mom had an engagement ring on. So I think I shared this story before, and he just looked at her and said, when you're ready to take that ring off, give me a call. So 2 weeks later, she did. Shortly after that, they were married. But sometimes we get into that place where we have somebody that we love, mother, father, and we think they do no wrong. And that was very much like Israel. They had a perfect king in King David. He was a man they thought could do no wrong, but David was just like all of us. He was a flawed human. He was broken. He was subject to failure and compromise, just like our moms or our dads. And David, over time, I don't know this for sure, but I think he became a bit prideful, believing that maybe he was entitled to everything he saw. He began to believe his own press. And his heart began to beat for earthly desires, and one discretion would lead to a multitude of other discretions. And isn't that the way it always happens? We sin once, and then it becomes a lot easier to sin the second time. We tell someone a lie, and then we have to form other lies in order to keep the first lie going. And on it goes. David, when he started out, when he was a young man, he had a heart that was given to God. It was marked by boldness and confidence in his Lord. He had surrendered to God. And in faith, he stepped out as a teenager and met this giant named Goliath on the battlefield. He knew that God had already won that victory. That's the kind of confidence he went out there with. And he continued to live with that boldness and with that confidence. He wrote a lot of the Psalms as he was out on the mountainside with sheep. And he spent endless times with God. And then after becoming the king, he fought many battles, and he led Israel in a great way, the beginning of the golden age of Israel. But as David moved into his middle years, he started giving in to compromise. His heart, which was once marked by integrity and boldness and confidence, began to become marked by compromise. And he gave in to lust and greed and pride. David didn't just wake up one morning and say, I'm going to have an affair with Bathsheba. As we look at David's life, we see that one by one, his barriers started to come down, and he made decisions that ultimately led to the implosion of his whole entire family. The decisions that he made affected not only him, not only Bathsheba, the woman he had an affair with, not just Uriah, Bathsheba's husband. They affected David's whole family, his kids, even his grandkids, and sin, the sin, particularly in his life, had a tremendous ripple effect. And a lot of us know this to be true because maybe we've compromised a little bit too. Today, I want to look at two roads. The first road is the road to compromise, and some of us, maybe we're on that road. Maybe we've been down that road. The second road is the road to integrity. That's the one we want to walk down, but sometimes we stumble and fall. A lot of us understand the road to integrity and compromise from experience. Some of us, it's just a theory. But that is the road that David started to walk down. In 2 Samuel 11, he lays out the pathway, the road to compromise. And I think, if we're honest with ourselves, we can all identify to an extent with this passage. We're all faced with different choices, almost daily. And David chose to make the wrong ones. He allowed the barriers to come down. He allowed the lines to be crossed. So let's look at what he did, the road to compromise. Let's look at that first. Let me read 2 Samuel 11, verse 1. It says, in the spring, at a time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with his king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. So everyone else is gone, and David stays home. He's been fighting with the men all along. He's been on the battlefields with the men all along. But here he decides to stay home. Something's going on. He's in the wrong place. And he decides to stay home, and the word continues in verse 2. It says, one evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of his palace. Now, that's not really a big deal. I mean, it was hot where he lived. A lot of people in the Middle East, I'm sure, they get up and walk on the roof with maybe there's a gentle breeze. They have problems sleeping because it's so hot. And so it makes sense. They go up to the roofs, get a little cooler. And maybe that's what David was doing. Maybe not. Maybe he has something else on his mind. Maybe he was bored. Maybe he was feeling a bit lonely. Maybe he was feeling a little bit of guilt because he was in the wrong place. So what is he doing up on that roof? And we see in the text, he's watching a naked woman. But how do we know that? Look what happens in the next phrase. It says, from the roof he saw a woman bathing. He goes up on his roof, and I don't know for sure, but I'm going to bet David knew exactly where to go on his roof to see what he wanted to see. I bet David not only was in the wrong place, but also at the wrong time. Many of us, if we're honest, we know exactly where to go to see what we want to see. Or for that matter, to hear what we want to hear. We might know to go online, channels to watch, books to read, people to talk to. people to talk to that will confirm what we're feeling in our hearts. And maybe it's not a visual thing for you. Maybe it's conversations you have. Sometimes we get involved with somebody we shouldn't get involved in. A little flirting takes place. It gets a little too intimate. Conversations take place. And it might not be a member of the opposite sex. It might be some of the relationships that you forge, that you start hanging out with people who like to gossip and complain. And here, for David, it was a sexual thing. David's doing that. He's going out. He's watching this woman bathe, and the text said he saw. And that word saw doesn't mean a glance. It means a gaze. He stared at her. He took a second, a third, and a fourth glance at this woman. I heard a speaker say, it's not the first look that hurts you. It's the second, third, and fourth ones that get you. It's interesting that David's palace is located at the top of a hill, and everything else is built on the slope under it. So the roof would have an incredible vantage point of looking into pretty much any courtyard. David was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he had the wrong focus. In verse 3 and 4, it says that the woman was very beautiful. And David sent someone to find out about her. And the man who he was asking to go and get her, the man said to David, and I love this because he was giving David an out. He said, isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? I wonder if he emphasized that last phrase there. The man was smart. He was giving David the way out, and he's saying, David, it's Uriah's wife. What are you doing? And then it says that David sent messengers to get her, and she came to him and he slept with her. Now, on a side note here, Bathsheba could not have come. She could have said, no, I can't. She could have stopped the action before it started. But we don't see anything in the text that she tried to do that at all. I don't see any words of resistance from her. To me, they both crossed the line and they both compromised. It says, as we continue on the text, that she went back home, and verse says, the woman conceived and sent word to David saying, I am pregnant. So let's take a look here at the road to compromise and the formula that it gives us. The wrong place plus the wrong time plus the wrong focus equals wrong action. Compromised action. And these are the three lines that David crossed. The wrong place, the wrong time, the wrong focus. And then he gave in to the wrong action. And I think the same is for us. When we compromise on these particular things, we're moving in the same direction. We're moving down that road of compromise. And we have this amazing way of convincing our mind that we're not. We have a tremendous ability to rationalize and justify. That's the way it is with us. We put ourselves in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong focus, and we end up making some pretty bad decisions. One by one, David's barriers were removed. One by one, lines in his heart, in our hearts, in our minds, even in our physical bodies, lines are crossed before we finally give in. It's interesting, Solomon knew all about the devastation of affairs. After all, he was David's son. He was David and Bathsheba's son. He wasn't the son they conceived. That during that event, that son died. They went on to have another son, Solomon, after David had married Bathsheba. And when Solomon was older, he wrote about the road to compromise. I think this is very interesting coming from his mouth. In Proverbs chapter 7, he says this, "At the window of my house I looked through the lattice. I saw the simple. I noticed among the young men a youth who lacked judgment. He was going down the street near her corner," wrong place, "walking along in the direction of her house by twilight, as the day was fading, as the dark of night set in," wrong time. "Then out came a woman to meet him, dressed like a prostitute and with crafty intent." Wrong focus. And notice the rest of it. She says, "Come, let's drink deeply of love till the morning. Let's enjoy ourselves with love. My husband is not home. He has gone on a long journey. He took his purse filled with money and will not be home till the full moon." With persuasive words, she led him astray. She seduced him with her smooth talk. Solomon's own words. She didn't have to persuade this guy too much. He had already gone to the wrong place at the wrong time and had the wrong focus. It only took a feather to push him over the line. And notice what else Solomon says in verse 22 of chapter 7. "All at once he followed her like an ox going to slaughter, like a deer stepping into a noose." You know, I found it interesting. I'm reading through Proverbs, my own personal devotions. Today was chapter 9. And what amazed me is in those first 9 chapters, Solomon is focusing on wisdom, gaining wisdom and understanding. But yet, in those first 9 chapters, 5 times, he elaborates extensively on this type of sexual sin. I guess it's pretty potent for Solomon. I guess it's pretty intimate with Solomon. I guess he understands it. Thus, in those first 9 chapters, he's emphasizing that wisdom is going to cause you not even to walk down that road to begin with. In America, in a study that I read, it says 35% of married men and 20% of married women have had affairs. Rarely does it lead to anything good either. It's like a noose, like Solomon was, it's like an ox to slaughter. It ultimately leads to devastation. Statistics say that only 25% of those marriages will survive. And of those 25%, 78% are described as empty and cold. There's a ripple effect that's taking place. Does God forgive David and us? When we come clean, he says that I take away the penalty of sin. But, yes, we still have to live with the consequences. Maybe Solomon wrote Proverbs chapter 6, verse 27 and 29 from first-hand experience. He says, "Can a man scoop fire into his lap without his clothes being burned? Can a man walk on hot coals without his feet being scorched? So it is he who sleeps with another man's wife. No one who touches her will go unpunished." I don't know, was Solomon thinking about his father at that point? A lot of us think that the grass is always greener on the other side. But the truth is, the grass is always greener wherever you water it. That's the road to compromise. Now, what about the road to integrity? And here is the road that God is calling us to travel. A road to integrity that begins with this. Number 1, being committed first and foremost to God. There is a man that I believe in Scripture that is clearly marked by this road to integrity, and that is a guy named Joseph, found in the books of Genesis. Joseph was Jacob's 11th son out of 12 boys total. And these 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel later on. But the 11th son, Joseph, was favored by his dad. I always wonder in this story, where was his mom? I don't know. Maybe after giving birth to 12 kids, she said, I'm not staying around anymore for 13. But the older boys, they know that their dad favors Joseph, and they get enraged over what their dad does. Jacob basically sets Joseph up for trouble by giving him this special coat of many colors, by favoring him over his brothers. And finally the brothers get sick of it, and sick of the younger brother, and they decide to kill him. They're tired of the favoritism, so they throw him into a pit. They think about killing him, but then one of the brothers convinces them. They decide that they can make a profit off of him, so they end up selling him as a slave, and he's taken to Egypt. And that's pretty much where trouble starts for him. In Egypt, he's purchased by a man named Potiphar. He's a high official in the Egyptian government, and Joseph is eventually elevated to a high position of overseeing Potiphar's whole household. He was a good worker. He was a good manager. There's only one problem. Potiphar has a wife. And back then, men of Potiphar's stature was pretty common for them to marry a young, beautiful woman. And he was a high official in Egypt, and that's kind of the way it works. So chances are this woman was a young, beautiful woman, and she just keeps hitting on Joseph. She keeps saying to him, come sleep with me, and he refuses again and again. He refuses to even be alone with her. And finally, at one point, she catches him alone. She grabs his coat, and he thinks, goodness, Lord, I can't stick around this. So he runs. He runs away. He doesn't say, I'm going to sin against my boss, or I'm going to sin against you, or sin against my future wife. This is what he says. How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Joseph is saying that his commitment is first to God. And if he sleeps with this woman, he's hurting most of all his relationship with God. And that is paramount to him. Again, being committed first and foremost to God is first on this road to integrity. That's where it begins. It's vital that we recognize that. When David confesses his sin in Psalm 51, he says, I have sinned against God. He realizes what he's done first and foremost is a violation against his relationship with God. So our first commitment needs to be to God. And when we speak vows to each other, as husband and wife, first and foremost, you are making a vow to God. When I perform weddings, that comes out very clear. Are you willing to share these vows with God and with one another? And this needs to be our first vow, because we are living for God. Regardless of what others do, this is the commitment we need to make first. So if we're married, this means that those vows that you spoke to this other person, first and foremost, you're speaking them to God. And God would have us align our relationships, our human relationships, that reflect that. Hebrews 13:4, it says, marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure, for God will judge the adulterer and the sexually immoral. In other words, if we're having relations, physical relations outside of our marriage, we set ourselves up against God. Now, our society, they've been compromising and walking along that road for a whole long time. And having physical relations outside marriage, it's pretty much just an accepted thing. In fact, it's an expected thing. Hey, everyone does it. I mean, it appalls me that that's assumed in our high schools, in our junior high schools. Everyone does it, but the Bible addresses that type of physical relationship out of the bonds of marriage between a man and a woman as wrong. You can't argue that point. Just read your Bible. Proverbs 15, or 5:15, in the Amplified Version says, drink waters out of your own cistern, meaning out of your own marriage relationship, and fresh running water out of your own well. God tells you to drink out of your own well. That is within marriage, having physical relations. So keep it for marriage. God also says he has a plan for our physical fulfillment in that area, and it happens within the bonds of marriage. He's very clear on that. After all, it's God's idea. He created it. He thought it up. And with the confines of marriage, it fulfills us greatly. And that's God's hope and desire for us, to keep that place pure. So how do we live out this commitment to God? Listen to what we're told in Psalm 119:9. Some of you have this verse memorized. How can a young man keep his way pure? And he answers this question. By living according to your word. What we need to do is say, God, I'm going to align myself to Scripture. I've got all kinds of voices in this world telling me it's okay. Compromise is okay. We all do it. And if it feels right, if it feels good, go ahead. Knock yourself out. But Scripture tells us to align ourselves with His Word. And that's exactly what we need to do if we want to walk down that road to integrity. That's the commitment we need to make. Paul tells us in 2 Timothy 2:22, flee the evil desires of youth and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart. So why should we run and flee like a Joseph when there's that road to compromise right in front of us? And we need to grab hold of his example. It speaks volume to us. Why do we run and flee? We recognize that none of us are strong enough to face temptation. So, our first commitment needs to be to God, sold out to Him and His Word. Secondly, we need to maintain proper boundaries. Why did Joseph run from Potiphar's wife? He ran because he realized he was in the wrong place. If he would have let his heart drift from God, he would have given in to the wrong time and the wrong focus, so he ran. He didn't know what else to do. He just took off. He knew that if he stuck around, things might not have ended well. So he ran. And God says, flee in Scripture. Maintain proper boundaries. Don't hang around places where you don't need to be. Don't be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, we've been focusing on David's indiscretion. And that's a physical sin, but we have a lot of others that take us down that road to compromise. I mean, if you have a drinking problem, then don't go to the bar to eat peanuts. If you have a problem gambling, it's not a good idea to take your vacation down to Atlantic City. Maintain healthy boundaries. We have to run from some situations because they create temptations that we don't want to be near. Make your commitment to God your first priority and then maintain healthy boundaries. And sometimes that might require us to run. Third, we also need to monitor our heart. When we're down that road of compromise, as I said before, we have this unique ability to rationalize and justify our thinking, and our thinking leads to actions, right? If my primary commitment is to God, then I'm going to stick with it. I'm going to work out those issues I'm struggling with in compromising, constantly working to maintain those healthy boundaries, but constantly monitoring our heart and being brutally honest with ourselves. Because we know that good things come to those who wait, and the word tells us that those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. Strength for what? Strength for not taking that road, and instead taking the other one, the road to integrity. It says they will mount up like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint. They will refuse to go to the wrong place at the wrong time and have the wrong focus. But the word also tells us in Matthew chapter 15, out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. These are what make a man unclean. If we aren't allowing God to purify and empower our hearts through His Spirit, the impurities of our heart are going to develop seeds of compromise. And if we keep things from God, we're going to venture down that road that we don't want to go on. It's important, I think, that we cry out like many of the prophets did. God, purify my heart. See if there be any offensive way in me, and lead me in a way everlasting. I want my heart to be clean before you. And I think we need to pray that a whole lot more than maybe we did. Because that road to compromise, even though we're using the example of David, we can compromise in an awful lot of other ways. What is our heart? It is who we are when we're alone, when no one is watching. It's the seat of our passions, of our thoughts, of our fantasies, of our emotions, of our desires. So we have to ask ourselves, Lord, is my heart given to you first? Or is it given to something or someone else? Proverbs 4:23. When Solomon's talking all about wisdom, he says this, above all else, guard your heart. It is the wellspring of life. So walking the road to integrity requires us to manage our minds. We need to make God number one priority, maintain proper boundaries, and monitor our hearts. And again, that's going to take some brutal honesty from us. Because some of us, it's not a physical thing, it's that we're struggling with. It's not, with some of us, it's just seeds of bitterness, seeds of anger. Somebody did us wrong, and we want them to hurt. Have you ever prayed, Lord, make life difficult for them? Where's the love in that? There's a heart problem right there. We do that. This unique ability to justify and rationalize. I deserve to be angry. They did me wrong. They need to struggle. They need to feel my pain. That's that road we don't want to go down. And fourthly, we need to manage what we allow into our minds. There are two ways to manage our minds. First, we have to remove the source of temptation. When temptation comes, and it will, don't dwell on it. Don't nurture those seeds of anger, those seeds of bitterness, the seeds of desire. Don't nurture, refuse to nurture. Don't dwell on it. Here's what Jesus said. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Before we cross that line physically, whatever it might be, we've already crossed it spiritually and emotionally. So Jesus says if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away, for it's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. He's not being literal here, but he's dead serious about what he's saying. Christians don't walk and shouldn't walk around with ice picks, ready to gouge out their eyes if they're tempted by something they shouldn't be looking at or thinking. Jesus wants us to remove that source of temptation in our lives. That might be just running, like Joseph did. But are we willing to remove or maybe unplug the internet if it's causing us to sin? And I'm not talking about just stuff that we're looking at, member of the opposite sex. I'm talking social media too. All we got to do is read social media and see these threads of anger, of accusation, of criticalness, of gossip. Are we willing to cut or limit a relationship or a conversation that leads to gossip and criticalness? I mean, let's face it. There are some people we need to limit our time around them. Because we know what's going to happen if we don't. And that's a hard thing. And nowhere is God saying, don't love this person. But he is saying, remove the source of temptation. Get away from it. Are we willing to cut out habits and remove temptations in order to walk this road of integrity? Because that's what Jesus wants for us. And that's hard to do at times. That's why we need his strength. Jesus wants to be Lord. He wants to be Savior of our life. He wants our hearts. And I think Jesus said to us, either I'm Lord of everything in your life or I'm not Lord at all. He wants us to let him govern every aspect of our life. And this doesn't mean that Christians aren't going to stumble and fall, because we are and we will. Because unlike our moms, we're not perfect. But it means when we do, we immediately confess it to the Lord and repent of it. It means that we're going to make a plan to live lives of integrity. And we might slip into that road of compromise, but we're not going to stay there. We're going to be comfortable there because our hearts belong to God. We can't be comfortable there. The life Jesus calls us to, it's not an easy one. It's one day at a time. Isn't it great? He says his mercies are new every morning. So we blow it on a Tuesday, guess what? We get a free slate the next morning. If we come and say, Lord, I slipped. Help me not to slip again. I don't want to stay here. The second thing, the first thing is we have to remove the source of temptation. Secondly, we have to set good standards. 2 Corinthians 10:5 says, we take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ. So what thoughts do you have that are in disobedience to Christ? Paul says we take them captive. We arrest those faults. We arrest those thoughts. Tony's an ex-policeman. He understands what arrest means. That means you put the handcuffs on him, you take him to the jail, and you put him in the cell. You arrest him. We don't sit there and we don't let him walk down the road. We have to do that with these thoughts that enter into our minds. We have to arrest them and say, God, I'm not going to dwell on this thought. Help me to not dwell on this thought. And I'm going to take that thought captive. I'm going to submit to you. I'm going to manage my mind. It's amazing the strength that we have when we come to Him, and this is our intent. Some of us might be surprised at how powerful it is when we come to Him and we say, Lord, I'm going to take captive this thought and choose to put it aside and focus in on you. I think some of us shortchange ourselves. We shortchange the power and the strength that God will give us when we come to that place. I will submit to you. I will manage my mind. We all have to do it, and we all can. This side of heaven, we are going to struggle. Jesus said that numerous times. In this world, you will have troubles. That's a promise. So we sit down, we say, Lord, it's supposed to be easy now. I've surrendered my life to know. He said, in this world you will have trouble. And if you choose to follow me, guess what? It's a rough road. But take heart. I will never leave you or forsake you. And even though the storms come, I'll get you through them. We all have to do it. We all have to take captive these disobedient thoughts and bring them into obedience of Christ. And understand, I'm not just talking about these lustful thoughts. I'm talking about the angry thoughts, the resentment, the bitterness towards somebody, maybe even a spouse, because they're not acting the way we think they should. And we have an expectation. I deserve better. You know what? Maybe you do. But this is where you are. So we choose. I'm going to choose to love. I'm going to choose to hate. I'm going to choose to be critical. I'm going to choose. See, that's the great thing. We're responsible for us. We're not responsible for the other person. So we can choose to love in spite of how they treat us. Maybe it's not a spouse, maybe it's a friend. It's amazing to me what happens when we make that choice. And I don't know about you, but I've had instances where I've made that choice, and instead of responding back to them in criticalness and anger, I let that go. I took that thought captive, and I chose to pray for them in a positive way, not in a negative way. And I've had some friends in the past that have then come up to me a short time later and said, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry about how I treated you. What have I just done? I've taken an enemy and made him a friend. Or I should say, God has taken my enemy and made them my friend. So in conclusion, where are you today? What road are you on? Are you on the road to compromise? Have you slipped there? Or are you on the road to integrity? Here's the great thing. As soon as we say, God, I don't want to be on this road. I don't want to compromise. I want to be on that road to integrity. He says, okay. That's what I was waiting for to hear you say. So let's go. Take a step over, get on this road, and we'll take it one day at a time. The road to compromise leads to, Solomon said, slaughter, abuse, devastation. That's what happened to David. The road to integrity leads to great things. It begins with our relationship with Jesus Christ. It begins when we give him our heart, when we surrender our heart. When we recognize that he came to die on the cross so that we could do that. So that we could have his strength and his power, his resurrection power. And we realize that we desperately need his forgiveness. We desperately need his strength to walk that road. We just can't do it without him. And if you think you can, there's a thought you need to take captive. Because you absolutely can't. We can't do it without him. And that's why we celebrate communion each and every week, to remind us that we can't. And that he can. And he's the one that we need to sell out to. And unlike David did, and to David's credit, he came around. In his senior years, we see a living legacy that takes place. And we see David come back. After all, Solomon is said to be the wisest man that ever walked the face of the earth. He was David's legacy. God did bless him in the end. But he slipped, fell on that road to compromise. And the only way back was God. And he finally realized that, got back on that road to integrity, and was blessed. So as we celebrate communion today, let's remind ourselves what road we want to be on. And let's take the painful measures that might require. Because we don't want to go down the other road. Maybe we can have a couple men come.